How does a brand that dressed the dream team end up fighting for space in the bargain aisle? That's the strange paradox of Champion. It was the American athletic brand, a century-old sportswear icon behind the dream team, the NBA uniforms, the college sweatshirts that defined an era. But prestige has a strange way of slipping through your fingers, especially when a brand stops understanding what made it powerful in the first place. Somewhere between the glory of the 90s and the chaos of the 2020s, Champion drifted from authentic sports icon to bargain store regular, caught between nostalgia and irrelevance. For a brief moment, it felt like they had a second chance, a streetwear-driven revival that suggested a comeback was possible. And yet, almost as quickly as it arrived, that momentum evaporated. So the question becomes unsettlingly simple. How does a century-old giant lose the plot so completely that its own parent company eventually classifies it as discontinued operations? Long before outlet racks and bargain aisles, Champion held a place in American culture that felt almost untouchable. Founded in 1919 by the Feinblum brothers, the company built its reputation through universities, high schools, and local teams, supplying durable athletic wear that became part of everyday American life. This wasn't fashion as we think of it today. It was function-driven sportswear engineered to last. When most brands focused on silhouettes or style, Champion focused on fabric weight, construction, and fit. That practicality became a kind of signature. The breakthrough was reverse weave, a technical innovation that prevented shrinkage and kept sweatshirts looking the same after years of wear. It didn't begin as a design statement, but it became one. By the 1970s and 80s, reverse weave sweatshirts were everywhere. In college bookstores, in locker rooms, in high school gym classes, on sidelines across the country. Students treated them the way they treated notebooks and backpacks, essential, familiar, and surprisingly sentimental. For generations, that small embroidered C on the sleeve became an unofficial badge of campus life. As Champion's footprint grew, so did its cultural presence. The brand wasn't just outfitting teams, it was outfitting the teams. Partnerships with professional leagues placed Champion at the center of American athletics, culminating in its most iconic moment, providing uniforms for the 1992 Olympic Dream Team. For millions watching around the world, those jerseys symbolized dominance, national pride, and a distinctly American kind of confidence. Seeing the Champion logo on that roster wasn't product placement, it was cultural validation. Even outside official sports, Champion threaded itself through everyday memory. Those heavyweight hoodies appeared in yearbook photos, training montages, early hip-hop fashion, and the kind of family snapshots that now feel nostalgic. It was a brand people trusted without thinking about it, reliable, consistent, and woven into moments they didn't know would matter later. This era, the late 80s into the early 90s, represented the height of Champion's identity. The sweatshirts weren't trend pieces. They were symbols of belonging, participation, and American athletic tradition. Champion stood for authenticity, durability, and the comfort of something that didn't need to change to stay relevant. For years, the place of Champion in American culture felt unshakable. But as the 1990s came to an end, the sportswear industry transformed into something far more global, far more aggressive, and far more competitive than anything Champion had prepared for. What was once a steady, dependable category suddenly revolved around billion-dollar marketing budgets, athlete endorsements, and the merging of performance with lifestyle. Brands like Nike and Adidas weren't simply selling clothing anymore. They were creating culture. Their sneakers defined status, their athletes influenced fashion, and their logos were embedded into music videos, advertising, and global events. They captured attention at a scale Champion had never operated on. And while those competitors poured money into innovation and storytelling, Champion's product line remained largely unchanged, dependable, familiar, but increasingly overshadowed. The impact appeared first in the places where Champion had once been strongest. Professional and collegiate teams began renewing contracts with competitors, drawn to their visibility, investment, and performance technologies. These weren't just business deals, they were symbols of legitimacy. When a brand loses them, it loses more than revenue. It loses presence. The slow erosion of these partnerships made Champion feel less central to the athletic world it once helped shape. In the absence of organic cultural momentum, Champion attempted a dramatic move back into the spotlight. In 2001, it became the exclusive outfitter for the XFL, the experimental football league created by WWE's Vince McMahon. It was a gamble meant to reintroduce Champion to a national audience, a bold attempt to align with a sport that promised edge and entertainment. But when the league collapsed after just one season, the association offered little more than a public reminder that Champion no longer held the authority it once did. Yet the most consequential shift wasn't a failed partnership, it was distribution. As sales softened, Champion expanded into mass-market retail, moving from sporting goods stores into chains like Walmart and Target. These retailers prioritized volume over brand identity, turning Champion into a label consumers encountered on bulk basics and budget-friendly activewear. The iconic C logo, once tied to collegiate pride and athletic durability, became a marker on cheaper essentials, indistinguishable from private label competitors. By the early 2000s, the transformation was complete. Champion still reached millions of shoppers, but the meaning had changed. It wasn't competing with Nike or Adidas anymore. It was competing with house brands and multi-packs. The shift into mass retail may have kept the company visible, but it fractured the brand's identity in a way that would become increasingly difficult to reverse. By the mid-2010s, Champion found itself in an unexpected position. After years of fading quietly into the background of American retail, the brand was suddenly everywhere again. Except this time, the momentum didn't come from professional sports or collegiate contracts. It came from a cultural shift Champion never orchestrated, but benefited from anyway. A generation that grew up in the 80s and 90s had reached adulthood, and with them came a wave of nostalgia that reshaped fashion. Vintage sweatshirts, old athletic logos, and retro collegiate styling felt comforting, authentic, and quietly cool. Champion's classic pieces, once dismissed as outdated, became coveted again, especially among younger shoppers who saw them not as basics, but as symbols of a past era they wanted to reclaim. Streetwear accelerated that transformation. The seeds of that moment were actually planted earlier. Supreme had been collaborating with Champion since around 2010, quietly reintroducing the brand to a new generation before most people noticed. By the mid-2010s, that underground credibility had surfaced into something much bigger. The rise of logo-heavy fashion and the blending of sportswear with everyday style created the perfect environment for Champion's rebirth. Artists like Chance the Rapper and Rihanna were photographed in Champion. Collaborations with Vetements and Bape gave the brand's oversized silhouettes genuine fashion credibility. Resale platforms filled with vintage pieces from the 80s and 90s. For the first time in decades, Champion felt relevant again, not because it changed, but because the culture around it had shifted in its direction. Retailers took notice. Urban outfitters, department stores, and boutique streetwear shops all capitalized on the trend, treating Champion as a heritage brand rather than a bargain label. Prices rose, limited drops sold out. Sales grew by roughly 22% at the peak of the revival. A brand once associated with gym class and budget racks suddenly found itself in the wardrobes of celebrities and trendsetters. But beneath the surface, the revival had a fragile foundation and a revealing contradiction. During this exact period, Champion was simultaneously selling at Supreme and at Walmart. The brand's own leadership publicly acknowledged it. They were everywhere from high-end streetwear boutiques to mass-market chains, all at once. That split identity was never resolved, and it meant the revival was building on unstable ground. Champion's resurgence came from aesthetic appeal and nostalgia, not from new innovation, new performance technologies, or a clear strategic repositioning. The brand was benefiting from cultural memory, not brand reinvention. And while the hype made sales spike, it didn't solve the structural issues that had weakened Champion long before the comeback began. Still, for a moment, it felt like a second life. Those classic silhouettes and bold sleeve logos reminded consumers why they had loved Champion in the first place, creating the illusion of stability. But an illusion is not the same as a turnaround. When the nostalgia wave began to cool and the streetwear bubble shifted, Champion's renewed momentum faced a test it couldn't withstand. The nostalgia boom gave Champion a temporary return to visibility. But by the early 2000s, the limits of that momentum began to show. When streetwear shifted and the resale-driven 90s aesthetic cooled, the brand found itself without a stable strategy beneath the hype. A revival built on cultural memory couldn't compensate for years of structural issues that had begun long before the comeback even started. Many of those issues traced back to the late 20th century, when Champion was absorbed into the massive portfolio of Sara Lee Corporation. What looked like a growth opportunity slowly turned into a long period of underinvestment. Sara Lee's focus lay elsewhere: food, household goods, and essentials, and Champion became just one of many subsidiaries expected to perform with limited innovation support. As competitors like Nike and Adidas scaled aggressively, Champion entered the 2000s with history, but not the strategic engine needed for the decade ahead. That lack of long-term investment became painfully visible when the nostalgia wave faded. Sales, which had surged during the mid-2010s streetwear moment, began falling sharply. According to HanesBrands' earnings reports, Champion's global revenue dropped 23% in the final quarter of 2023 and an even steeper 26% in the first quarter of 2024. In the United States, the decline hit 35%. Inventory accumulated, demand softened, and competition intensified. What had once looked like a comeback was now clearly a correction. But sales were only part of the crisis. HanesBrands, which acquired Champion from Sara Lee years earlier, carried more than $3 billion in debt. Activist investor Barrington Capital began publicly pressuring the company to take action, improve performance, restructure operations, and lighten the balance sheet. Champion, once the most recognizable name in HanesBrands' portfolio, had become its biggest strategic question mark. By early 2024, HanesBrands made a decisive move. Champion was reclassified as discontinued operations, signaling to investors that the brand no longer fit into the company's long-term vision. For a label with more than a century of history, it was a stark acknowledgement that the revival had not translated into sustainable growth. The next step was inevitable: a sale. Multiple buyers explored the possibility, but one stood out: Authentic Brands Group. The company known for acquiring legacy or distressed brands such as Reebok, Quicksilver, and Forever 21. In June 2024, HanesBrands announced that Champion would be sold to Authentic in a deal valued at up to $1.5 billion, with performance incentives. For HanesBrands, the sale provided a much-needed financial boost. For Champion, it marked the end of the era in which the brand controlled its own design, distribution, and strategy. What comes next for a heritage sportswear icon once defined by authenticity, and now entering a world where success depends on licensing, operators, and global brand managers? The sale didn't end Champion's story. It simply moved it into a different kind of ecosystem. Under its new ownership, the brand enters a model built less on in-house design and more on partnerships, regional operators, and licensing agreements across categories. A brand is no longer guided by a single creative engine. Instead, it is interpreted through manufacturers, distributors, and retailers who each shape a small piece of its identity. For Champion, that shift raises a complicated question. What does authenticity look like when the brand itself isn't steering the wheel anymore? Licensing can expand reach, open new channels, and introduce Champion to markets it struggled to access before, but the trade-off is consistency. With every new operator comes a slightly different version of the same logo, and with every new category comes the risk that the brand becomes defined by volume rather than vision. There is opportunity. Heritage still resonates, especially with younger shoppers who are drawn to nostalgia and archival silhouettes. And Champion has something most activewear brands never achieve: a shape, a fabric, and a feel that are instantly recognizable. Reverse weave alone is powerful enough to anchor a future if handled carefully, but the athletic market Champion once dominated has become far more stratified. The question now is whether a brand run through partnerships rather than a central vision can become something meaningful again, or whether it will remain a symbol of what happens when heritage meets the realities of modern brand management. Curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and as always, see you in the next one.